Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. The Aegis Prime orbital watchtower hung in the blackness like a jagged iron spear. It was a monument of cold, suffocating metal, drowning in the oppressive hum of fusion reactors, the sharp scent of ozone, and the endless grinding of industrial life support systems. Within its sprawling central concourse, the absolute elite of the galaxy gathered. These were the Void Hunters, apex predators of the deep cosmos, hardened mercenaries who conquered the unknown. They paced the reinforced deck plates, adorned in biomechanical exoskeletons, synthetic muscle fibers, and neuro-linked magnetic armor. A single arm prosthesis on any of these men, or women, contained enough destructive yield and advanced alloys to purchase an entire stellar fleet. They were walking warships, radiating neon plasma light, sheer arrogance, and the intimidating hum of pure technological supremacy. Through this sea of glowing energy shields and the high-voltage crackle of weaponry walked Dylan Britton. He was a stark, almost jarring contrast to everything around him. He did not possess a single cybernetic enhancement. He wore no magnetic shielding, carried no plasma rifles, and lacked even a basic neural link implant. Instead, he wore a faded canvas jacket over a standard, bulky atmospheric suit. His bare, organic hands gripping the worn leather handle of a heavy rectangular suitcase. The contents of that case were a complete anomaly in a station powered by dark matter and quantum physics. Dylan carried analog microseismometers, mechanical acoustic oscillators, copper coils, and a set of heavy steel tuning forks. His registered title on the holographic bounty board flashed in dull amber letters, displaying a rank considered the absolute lowest, most pathetic classification in the Guild Registry Acoustic Sweeper Apprentice. He stepped into the registration ring to process his deployment. The station's artificial intelligence, a floating orb of blue light, projected a high-density scanning grid over him. A sterile, synthesized voice echoed across the massive hall, analyzing his gear for the public record. The AI system stuttered briefly, unable to find a modern equivalent for his items. It declared his equipment as unidentifiable anomalies, reclassifying them strictly as primitive antiques from the first era of spaceflight. It loudly broadcasted that the subject possessed 0 energy signatures, 0 quantum processing units, 0 defensive fields, and 0 offensive capabilities. A wave of laughter erupted from the surrounding Void Hunters. The booming, metallic guffaws of heavy cyborgs echoed against the titanium bulkheads, a harsh sound of absolute mockery. They pointed their heavy, laser-calibrated gauntlets at the fragile human who dared to bring analog tools to the edge of the abyss. Some joked that he was there to fix the station's sanitation pipes. Dylan did not flush with embarrassment. He did not clench his fists or speak a single word of defense. He merely offered a quiet, polite smile, snapped his suitcase open, and carefully adjusted the prongs of a heavy steel tuning fork, ignoring the chorus of insults. The mocking laughter abruptly died down as the heavy blast doors at the far end of the concourse slid open with a deafening hiss. A blinding array of golden hard light projectors announced the arrival of Princess Valia of the Etherian Empire. She was radiant, an aristocratic vision draped in fabrics woven from programmable starlight, floating slightly above the floor on anti-gravity treads. She was flanked by an imposing entourage of royal guards whose armor shimmered with shifting active camouflage. Valia had come to Aegis Prime for one highly classified purpose. She was here to personally inspect the most renowned hunting squad in the sector, preparing them for an unprecedented, incredibly dangerous mission to salvage an ancient, derelict battleship currently drifting in the dead zone. Her eyes, augmented with flawless analytical lenses, swept over the imposing, heavily armed void hunters. She nodded in approval at their firepower. But then, her gaze landed on the lone, unremarkable figure standing by the registration console. The contrast was deeply offensive to her imperial sensibilities. Valia halted her royal procession and stepped directly in front of Dylan, the temperature in the room dropping as the crowd fell utterly silent. She looked down at his mechanical instruments, her lips curling into a smile that was intensely sweet, yet perfectly lethal. It was the smile of someone accustomed to erasing planets from star maps. "I was explicitly informed that the Guild would supply us with the absolute pinnacle of survival expertise," Valia said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent, cavernous hall. "Instead, I see they have sent a Bronze Age plumber to accompany my void hunters. To allocate even a fraction of the Empire's budget to someone wielding museum artifacts is not merely a joke. It is a profound, unforgivable insult to our intelligence." The royal guards snickered from behind their visors, and the surrounding hunters puffed out their heavily armored chests, eager to see the pathetic apprentice grovel, apologize, or flee the station entirely. Dylan did not react to the venom dripping from her words. He slowly, methodically closed his suitcase. The mechanical latches clicked shut with a sharp, heavy thud that cleanly cut through the background electronic hum of the station. He raised his right hand, holding the cold steel tuning fork he had just finished adjusting. With a gentle, deliberate motion, he tapped the metal against the solid titanium railing of the registration console. A pure, low-frequency hum resonated outward. It was not a digital sound. It was a physical vibration, a raw mechanical wave that bypassed audio receptors and vibrated directly within the chest cavities of everyone standing nearby. It felt incredibly ancient. It felt heavy enough to crush bone. Dylan looked up, meeting the princess's glowing synthetic eyes with his own organic, unwavering gaze. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet, chilling certainty. "There are things in the dark that do not fear the light, Your Highness," Dylan said softly, the mechanical resonance of the fork fading into the heavy air. "They only fear silence." The shuttle detached from the airlock of the colossal derelict with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed into the endless corridors. They were deep within the dead zone now, standing inside the belly of an ancient super battleship that had drifted silently for over 300 years. The air inside the staging bay was stale, tasting of rusted iron and dead centuries. Shadows stretched abnormally long, distorting the shapes of the hunting party. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the elite squad, the sheer, crushing scale of the dead vessel made them look like insignificant insects crawling inside the ribcage of a leviathan. At the front of the formation, the Void Hunters made their presence known with arrogant, deafening displays of force. When a colossal bulkhead door groaning under the weight of rusted hydraulic locks barred their path, the squad did not bother searching for a manual override. The hunter captain, a towering brute of a cyborg, simply raised his arm cannon. A blinding beam of high-intensity plasma erupted from the barrel, instantly vaporizing the heavy titanium locking mechanism with a deafening shriek of boiling metal. Liquid slag splattered across the deck plates. The hunters cheered, their neural-linked armor flaring with neon blue energy as they stomped through the breach threshold. Following far behind the vanguard, relegated to the rear guard of the logistics detail, Dylan Britton flinched. He did not flinch from the heat, but from the chaotic, aggressive shockwaves tearing through the ship's infrastructure. He knelt beside the freshly breached blast door, ignoring the glowing slag. He carefully retrieved a mechanical microseismometer from his canvas bag and bolted it to the cold deck plate. The needle on the analog dial danced erratically, sketching frantic peaks on a small roll of paper. "You need to dial back the high-intensity energy outputs," Dylan said, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to carry. The acoustic reverberations from those plasma bursts are traveling down the central structural spines. You are ringing this ship like a massive dinner bell. Princess Valia, floating effortlessly on her anti-gravity treads just a few paces away, let out a soft, melodic laugh. She turned to her heavily armed royal entourage, using Dylan as a live prop for an impromptu lecture on imperial supremacy. "Pay close attention, my guards," Valia said, her tone dripping with polished condescension. "Observe the tragedy of a species that stalled in its evolution. While we command the raw fabric of quantum physics, the human attempts to measure the infinite cosmos with children's toys. He fears echoes. He thinks a ruined metal shell can hear us. This is why their worlds contribute less than 0.5% to the galactic gross domestic product. They are governed by superstition rather than data." Dylan did not argue. He merely unbolted his instrument, packed it away, and moved to the next support pillar. But as the squad ventured deeper, descending toward the lower engineering decks, the psychological weight of the ship began to press down on the intruders. The shadows seemed to swallow the glare of their tactical lights too quickly. A suffocating feeling of being observed, of being measured in the absolute dark, gnawed at the edges of their minds. Dylan, stopped by a massive load-bearing strut, running his bare hand over the cold surface. He frowned. He pulled out a small magnifying loupe and examined the metal. This was the first terrifying revelation. The official guild report stated that this super battleship had been disabled in a historic fleet engagement. Yet, there were no plasma scorch marks here. There were no explosive impact craters, no kinetic penetrations, and no signs of rapid depressurization from railgun fire. Instead, the structural beams of the corridor were warped. The solid titanium alloy, nearly 2 meters thick, was twisted and folded in on itself like wet clay. It was not combat damage. It was systemic structural failure caused by a localized gravitational singularity, or worse, an unimaginably massive, sustained low-frequency sound wave that had literally shaken the ship's skeleton until the metal fatigued and melted from the kinetic friction of its own vibration. Dylan pressed his ear directly against the cold, warped bulkhead. He closed his eyes, tuning out the harsh, loud banter of the hunters. Beneath the groaning of the dead ship, beneath the hum of the hunter's armor, he found it. A rhythm. It was agonizingly slow, deep, and rhythmic. It was a metallic heartbeat, pulsing exactly one time every 45 seconds, emanating from the absolute lowest level of the ship. It was not a machine. Machines did not breathe like that. Dylan immediately abandoned his gear, sprinting up the corridor until he caught the hunter captain's heavy shoulder plating. "Cut your power," Dylan ordered, his voice stripped of all its previous politeness, replaced by a harsh, urgent command. "Kill the plasma cores. Deactivate the active camouflage. Shut down the magnetic shielding right now. There is a massive biological entity on the lowest deck, and it uses energy emissions as a biological radar. We are broadcasting our exact coordinates." The captain grabbed Dylan by the collar of his atmospheric suit, lifting the human off the deck with effortless, terrifying strength. The cyborg's synthetic eyes glared with absolute contempt. "Listen to me, you pathetic little scavenger," the captain growled, dropping Dylan back onto his feet. "I have hunted on 50 different death worlds. I do not hide in the dark. I own the dark. If there is a beast down there, we will mount its skull on the bow of my command ship." The captain turned his back on Dylan and raised his fist, signaling the entire squad. "Switch to active hunting protocols," the captain roared. "Maximum power. I want a full electromagnetic sweep of the lower decks. Overcharge the sensory nets to 120%. Every hunter in the corridor activated their deep penetration scanners simultaneously. A massive, invisible pulse of electromagnetic radiation exploded outward from the squad, tearing through the deck plates to map the abyss below. The reaction was instantaneous. The metallic heartbeat Dylan had heard suddenly stopped. A second later, the ambient temperature in the corridor plummeted by 60 degrees. Frost instantly crystallized across the walls, snapping and crackling as the air froze. Then, the neon lights of the hunter's armor, the tactical flashlights, and Valia's golden hard-light projectors flickered wildly. With a sound like a dying gasp, every single photon of light in the corridor was violently ripped away, swallowed into absolute, crushing blackness. The blackness was not empty. It was alive. Tendrils of supercooled mist slithered down from the vaulted ceiling. These were the apex void stalkers. They were the absolute ghosts of the dead zone. They held no physical shape. They moved like swirling, freezing ash in a hard vacuum. They did not hunt flesh. They did not hunt bone. They hunted pure power. By initiating a maximum energy sweep, the hunters had just lit a massive beacon in the dark. The captain roared a deafening battle cry. He raised his heavy right arm. His shoulder-mounted plasma cannon discharged. A blinding streak of blue sunfire illuminated the long corridor. It struck the absolute center of the largest cloud of ash. There was no explosion. There was no scream of agony. The stalker simply absorbed the blast. The brilliant blue plasma shifted into a dull, sickly violet, then vanished completely. The creature swelled in massive size. It had fed. It wanted more. Panic shattered the iron discipline of the legendary squad. The hunters opened fire. Lasers cut violently through the dark. Magnetic drivers launched high-velocity slugs sheathed in quantum fields. It was a fatal, irreversible mistake. Every single shot fed the swarm. The stalkers descended rapidly. The massacre was perfectly silent. A stalker swept over a heavy gunner. The hunter's energy shield flared brightly for a fraction of a second, then snapped entirely out of existence. The creature passed straight through his thick exoskeleton. The advanced cybernetics died instantly. The neural links severed. The synthetic muscle fibers locked solid. The hunter collapsed, entirely trapped within a 2-ton iron coffin. He suffocated alone in the dark. The formation collapsed. The hunters broke rank and ran. They fired wildly into the empty air. Their weapons died in their hands. Their glowing armor faded to dead gray. The apex predators of the galaxy were reduced to panicked, helpless animals. They fell one by one. The metal deck vibrated violently with the heavy, sickening thuds of dead armor hitting the floor. The legendary Void Hunters vanished in less than 60 seconds. Valia backed away. Her elite royal guards formed a desperate defensive wall in front of her. It meant nothing. A wave of ash washed over them. Their active camouflage short-circuited. Their life support monitors flatlined. They dropped heavily to the floor, instantly entombed in their own high-tech suits. Valia was completely alone. Her anti-gravity treads sparked violently. The levitation field died. She crashed hard onto the frozen metal deck. She scrambled backward in sheer terror. Her back hit the freezing bulkhead. There was nowhere left to run. Her personal hard-light shield activated automatically. A golden dome of energy encased her. It was the absolute pinnacle of Imperial defense technology. A massive void stalker loomed over her. It descended like a suffocating, freezing shroud. It wrapped its formless mass around the golden dome. The temperature dropped even further. Valia stared at her wrist monitor. The power levels plummeted. 90%, 60%, 30%. The golden light flickered weakly. The shield groaned under the impossible. Rapid drain. 10%, 5%. The swirling ash pressed heavily against the fading barrier. She saw the absolute void waiting for her. 2%. She closed her eyes. She waited for the cold to take her. Heavy footsteps hammered the deck. They were organic. They were unarmored. They were desperate. Dylan Britton burst out from the shadows. He carried no weapons. He wore no shield. He threw himself onto the freezing deck, right beside the princess. He gripped a heavy, solid steel grounding rod. He found a narrow structural seam in the floor plating. He drove the sharp point of the rod directly into the gap. He slammed the heel of his bare hand violently against the flat top, wedging the metal deep into the ship's skeleton. He pulled a heavy mechanical oscillator from his coat. It was pure clockwork. It possessed thick brass gears and heavy steel springs. He locked it firmly onto the grounding rod. He grabbed the manual crank. He yanked it violently. The internal springs uncoiled. The heavy gears slammed together. A massive, physical wave of acoustic force ripped outward. Dylan had set the gears to the exact inverse frequency of the ship's ambient electromagnetic resonance. It was not an energy field. It was raw, kinetic vibration. The sound wave struck the air. It violently shattered the electromagnetic signatures of everything in the corridor. It created an immediate, heavy bubble of absolute acoustic and thermal static. Space went completely deaf. The digital world was entirely erased by analog noise. The stalker, feeding on Valia's shield, violently recoiled. Its smoky form shuddered uncontrollably. Without the electromagnetic signals to guide it, the creature was instantly blinded. Dylan and Valia simply ceased to exist in its spectrum. The princess stared in absolute shock. The deadly shroud of ash hovered mere inches away from her face. Totally disoriented, Dylan stayed perfectly still. He did not breathe. He did not blink. The stalkers drifted blindly through the corridor. Their freezing tendrils swept the empty air, passing right through the space where the humans crouched. Feeling absolutely nothing. The predators were completely lost in the acoustic static. The silence was heavy. It was terrifying. But as Dylan watched the swirling masses of ash, he noticed something deeply wrong. The stalkers were not actively searching. They were not circling in a hunting pattern. They were huddled tightly against the ceiling. Their smoky forms vibrated erratically. They were shuddering. The realization hit Dylan like a physical blow to the chest. The apex void stalkers, the most feared entities in the entire dead zone, had not been hunting the squad. They had not been waiting in ambush. They were in a state of absolute, frantic panic. Dylan looked at the dark shafts leading down to the engineering decks. The monsters were orienting themselves away from the deep. They were not attacking out of bloodlust. They were desperate. The apex predators were running away. They were fleeing in pure terror from whatever was waking up at the bottom of the ship. The silence left in the wake of the acoustic blast was heavier than the freezing void. Dylan moved first. He did not power up a flashlight. He did not activate a communication channel or rely on any encrypted radio waves. He reached out and tapped a heavy brass key against the frozen steel wall. 2 sharp clicks. A pause. 1 click. It was a primitive, mechanical command. Follow. 3 hunters had managed to manually disengage the emergency seals of their dead exoskeletons before the freeze set in completely. Stripped of their towering, expensive armor, the legendary mercenaries were reduced to shivering, terrified flesh. They fell in line, following the acoustic breadcrumbs, trailing closely behind the princess. Valia walked in an absolute daze. Her programmable starlight fabrics were torn, completely drained of power, and stained with heavy machine grease. Without her optical augments and levitation treads, she was stumbling and practically blind. Yet, she kept her eyes fixed on the silhouette of the human, moving steadily ahead of her. Dylan navigated the twisted, hazardous corridors with absolute, terrifying precision. He stepped over jagged metal debris and ducked under sagging bulkheads as if reading a highly detailed topographical map, written entirely in the shadows. He had no genetic enhancements. He possessed no infrared ocular implants. He simply understood the natural flow of the dark. He felt the subtle changes in ambient air pressure against his skin. He measured the faint shifts in acoustic feedback bouncing off the ruined walls. He was a creature perfectly adapted to the abyss. For the first time in her long, privileged life, Valia understood the fundamental, fatal flaw of the Aetherian Empire. Her people, alongside the elite hunting guilds, had outsourced their survival to machines. They conquered the galaxy by building louder, brighter, and stronger weapons. Millennia of absolute technological supremacy had made them arrogant, complacent, and soft. They had forgotten how to listen to the universe. Humanity was drastically different. Born on a hostile, unforgiving planet, the human race had spent tens of thousands of years as the prey. Their ancestors survived not by roaring into the wild, but by adapting, hiding, and blending into the harsh, overwhelming elements. Dylan was not a low-class anomaly. He was the supreme culmination of a species forced by nature to master the art of insignificance. They eventually reached a heavily insulated maintenance shaft near the outer hull. Dylan signaled for a halt with a single tap, sealing the manual pressure hatch tightly behind them. It offered a brief, safe pocket of breathable air and a momentary respite from the crushing dread outside. Valia collapsed heavily against the wall, her breath misting into the cold air. She looked up at Dylan, who was quietly inspecting his analog instruments in the dim, flickering light of a single chemical flare. "How did you know?" Valia asked. Her voice was entirely stripped of its previous imperial authority, reduced to a fragile, genuine whisper. "How did you know how to vanish right in front of them?" Dylan did not look up immediately. He carefully wiped the condensation from a brass gear before sliding the oscillator back into his heavy coat. "My ancestors learned the hard way, Your Highness," Dylan said softly. "Long before we broke the atmosphere, we fought devastating wars in the deep oceans of Earth. We built massive, primitive metal tubes called submarines. We sent crews of 80 or 90 men into the crushing abyss, sometimes plunging hundreds of meters below the surface. Down there, the water pressure would instantly crush a human body into nothing. The darkness was absolute. They had no windows. They had no light to guide them." Valia listened intently, captivated by the grim, ancient history. "They lived in that dark for months at a time," Dylan continued. "They hunted each other in the blind depths. The only way to find the enemy, or to survive, was through sound. A single acoustic ping could give away your exact location. The men inside those vessels wore soft-soled shoes. They spoke only in hushed whispers. If someone accidentally dropped a heavy steel wrench onto the metal deck, the noise would travel through the water for miles. That one tiny sound would bring an explosive torpedo straight to their hull. They did not survive by possessing the thickest armor or the brightest lasers. They survived by becoming one with the silence. They learned to listen to the ocean." He finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dull, chemical glow of the flare. "The universe is just a bigger ocean, and we are still sitting in a submarine." The remaining journey to the outer airlock was grueling, but completely devoid of conflict. Dylan guided the broken remnants of the elite hunting party through the belly of the dead beast, relying entirely on his acoustic tapping to map the safe paths. They finally breached the staging bay and boarded the Royal Escape Shuttle. The heavy airlock sealed shut. The engines ignited with a violent roar, tearing them away from the drifting derelict. Inside the illuminated cabin of the rescue ship, the atmosphere shifted drastically. The surviving hunters sat slumped in the corners, staring blankly at the floor. No one spoke a single word. No one mocked the human. The princess sat quietly across from Dylan, offering him a look of profound, unspoken reverence. The acoustic sweeper apprentice had saved them when the absolute pinnacle of galactic engineering had failed. The shuttle engaged its quantum slipstream drive, rocketing back toward the Aegis Prime orbital watchtower. They were safe. The nightmare was seemingly over. But as Dylan stared out the reinforced viewport at the swirling stars, his face remained strictly grim. He placed his bare hand against the cold glass, feeling the heavy, rhythmic vibration of the shuttle's immense thrust. His analog instincts screamed at him. The stalkers had been absolutely terrified. They were running away from the lowest decks, and in their desperate bid to escape, the shuttle had just burned a massive, highly visible energy trail straight through the center of the dead zone. He knew the chilling truth. The mission was not finished. The silence was only temporary. The terrifying, unseen Leviathan at the bottom of the ancient ship had not been left behind. It had picked up their violent acoustic and thermal scent, and it was silently following their wake straight home. The great assembly hall of Aegis Prime was a theater of corporate judgment and political tension. Over 15,000 delegates, nobles, and high-ranking military officials filled the sweeping amphitheater. The air buzzed with severe, restless energy. A mission that was supposed to secure trillions of credits in salvage had ended in utter humiliation. At the center of the vast obsidian floor stood the 3 surviving members of the vanguard. Stripped of their ranks and heavy armor, they looked small and broken beneath the glaring spotlights. The Grand Inquisitor of the Tribunal, a towering figure draped in heavy crimson robes, slammed a ceremonial gavel against a sonic amplifier. The booming echo forced the massive crowd into a grim silence. "This tribunal finds the vanguard guilty of gross negligence and cowardice," the Inquisitor declared, his heavily augmented voice shaking the reinforced glass of the viewing galleries. "You abandoned an assignment funded by the combined treasuries of 7 star systems. You fled from a derelict husk, leaving behind priceless assets. The penalty is immediate and permanent exile." Before the armored guards could escort the disgraced mercenaries away, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the heavy atmosphere. "Halt!" Princess Valia stepped out from the royal enclosure. The crowd gasped in collective shock. She was not wearing her programmable starlight fabrics or floating on anti-gravity treads. She walked barefoot across the cold, obsidian floor, dressed in a simple, unadorned morning gown of dark silk. The physical manifestation of her imperial pride had been completely stripped away. She walked past the towering inquisitors, past the angry guildmasters, and stopped directly in front of the logistics observation deck, where Dylan Britton stood in silence. The entire hall held its breath. Valia turned to face the thousands of delegates. "The vanguard did not fail because of cowardice," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the massive space without the need for artificial amplification. "They failed because everything we believe about power is a fatal lie. We walked into the abyss wrapped in quantum shields, convinced that we were untouchable. We were arrogant, loud, and completely blind." She paused, letting the heavy truth settle over the angry crowd. "Our elite technology became a beacon for death," Valia continued, her tone unwavering. "When the absolute darkness came for us, our lasers and magnetic drivers were utterly useless. The weapons that conquered entire sectors turned into a feast for the void. We were dead. All of us." She turned back to Dylan. The human apprentice stood quietly in his faded canvas jacket, holding his battered leather suitcase. "We survived solely because of him," the princess declared. "Because humanity never forgot how to be vulnerable. Because his primitive, analog understanding of the universe outsmarted the true predators of the deep." In full view of 15,000 galactic elites, Princess Valia of the Etherian Empire broke a 10,000-year-old royal protocol. She lowered her head, bent her knees, and delivered a deep, solemn bow to the human scavenger. Chaos erupted. The amphitheater exploded into a deafening roar of outrage. Nobles slammed their fists against the viewing glass. Elite hunters from rival guilds shouted violent curses, their cybernetic implants flaring with angry red energy. "This is an orchestrated farce," screamed a high-ranking guildmaster from the upper balconies, pointing an accusatory finger. "It is mathematically impossible. Our fusion grids cannot be bested by a human holding a brass clock. You are shielding cowards with a fabricated ghost story to protect your own political standing." The shouts grew louder, merging into a violent wave of political unrest. They refused to accept the vulnerability of their metal gods. They refused to believe that the absolute pinnacle of civilization could be defeated by a species they deemed entirely insignificant. Then, the ultimate judgment arrived. It did not announce itself with a warning siren. It happened instantly. Every single light source in the Great Assembly Hall died at the exact same millisecond. The glowing data streams, the holographic banners, the neon cybernetics, all of it snapped into absolute blackness. The artificial gravity generators whined violently before failing completely, sending a sickening wave of weightlessness rippling through the massive chamber. The environmental life support systems ground to a brutal halt. The air grew instantly thin, leaving the lungs of 15,000 panicking delegates burning for oxygen. A horrific vibration followed. It was not a roar of a beast. It was the terrifying, tearing sound of the space-time continuum being violently ripped apart. A kinetic shockwave struck the space station, buckling the massive titanium support pillars like cheap tin. Outside the reinforced panoramic windows, the stars vanished. They were not blocked by a nebula or a fleet of ships. They were swallowed by a massive, writhing shadow. The Nullbringer had arrived. It was the mother of the abyss, the eldritch horror that had sent the ghosts of the dead zone fleeing in blind terror. Its sheer scale was impossible to comprehend. The entity dwarfed the entire Aegis Prime watchtower, wrapping its cosmic, formless bulk around the installation like a leviathan coiling around a sinking metal cage. The station's automated defense grid triggered its final, desperate protocol. Thousands of heavy antimatter cannons and high-yield plasma torpedoes launched simultaneously from the exterior hull. It was a blinding display of apocalyptic firepower, enough concentrated energy to shatter a small moon. The Nullbringer did not even flinch. The massive energy barrage struck the creature's surface and was instantly, silently absorbed. The void entity drank the nuclear fire like it was a drop of water. The resulting energy backlash surged directly back into the station. Every hunter in the Great Hall who possessed combat implants or magnetic armor was violently electrocuted by their own gear. The strongest warriors in the galaxy convulsed and collapsed to the floor, their high-tech enhancements short-circuiting into dead, burning slag. The political theater was gone. The arrogant shouts were silenced, as the monstrous tentacles of the Nullbringer began to slowly crush the external hull of the station. The surviving billions of credits worth of technology meant absolutely nothing. The ticking time bomb had finally detonated, pushing everyone into a state of total, inescapable despair. The Great Assembly Hall was a graveyard of dying gods. Thousands of the galaxy's most advanced beings lay paralyzed on the obsidian floor, their lungs burning as the life support systems failed. The crushing weight of the void pressed against the shattered panoramic windows. Colossal tendrils of cosmic shadow, bleeding with an angry, violent crimson light, slithered through the cracks in the titanium glass. The Nullbringer was breaching the sanctuary. It was not a localized attack. It was the physical manifestation of an apocalypse, preparing to scour the station of all organic and synthetic life. Amidst the paralyzing terror and the desperate, suffocating gasps of the galactic elite, Dylan Britton moved. He did not rush. He did not display the frantic panic of the paralyzed warriors around him. He walked steadily toward the absolute center of the grand amphitheater. As he walked, he unbuckled his heavy atmospheric canvas jacket, letting it slip from his shoulders and hit the floor. He discarded his rebreather mask. He stripped away every last piece of standard protective gear, standing under the failing emergency lights in nothing but his simple mechanic uniform. Every eye in the dying hall, including Princess Valia's, locked onto the fragile human. He was a speck of dirt standing before a cosmic hurricane. It was the most absurd, fragile hope imaginable. Dylan dragged his heavy leather suitcase to the central environmental control spire, a thick pillar of exposed hull metal that connected directly to the station's external skeleton. He knelt and opened the case. He bypassed the digital interfaces completely, wielding a heavy steel wrench to violently pry off the access panel. He pulled out a massive, crude mechanical transceiver, a heavy box of copper wire, brass dials, and large magnetic coils. He wired the primitive analog system directly into the exposed acoustic framework of the Aegis Prime station. The first tendril of the massive entity shattered the main viewing port entirely. A deafening vacuum roar ripped through the hall, but the entity's own crushing mass instantly plugged the breach, sealing the atmosphere but bringing its monstrous, writhing presence directly into the room. The crimson glow of the tendrils radiated pure agony. It raised a massive, shadowy scythe, preparing to bring it down upon the helpless thousands. Dylan gripped the heavy iron crank of his transceiver. He closed his eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and began to turn the handle. He did not broadcast a weaponized frequency. He did not send an acoustic shockwave to shatter the creature. He transmitted a song. It started as a deep, rhythmic thud. It was the sound of a human heartbeat, slowed down to the absolute resting state of deep, untroubled sleep. The steady, comforting rhythm pulsed through the copper wires, resonating through the entire metallic skeleton of the massive space station. The hull plates themselves became the massive speakers. Then, Dylan engaged a secondary brass dial, layering another sound over the heartbeat. It was a sound that had not been heard in the galaxy for thousands of years. It was the haunting, profoundly deep, and majestic song of the ancient blue whale from the oceans of Earth. The mournful, beautiful melody vibrated with a frequency so incredibly low and rich that it bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly within the soul. It was the sound of absolute, undisturbed peace. It was the lullaby of the abyss. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. The massive shadow scythe stopped mere inches from the delegates. This was the greatest misunderstanding in the history of the cosmos. As the deep, resonant frequencies of Earth's oceans washed over the Leviathan, the horrifying truth became brilliantly clear. The Nullbringer was not a predator. It was not a malicious god of destruction. It was an ancient, biomechanical satellite, a gentle cosmic gardener from a forgotten epoch. But for thousands of years, the aggressive, deafening electromagnetic pollution of the modern galaxy, the high-frequency radar sweeps, the screaming plasma reactors, and the harsh quantum chatter had driven the creature to the brink of absolute madness. It had been living in an ocean of unbearable, blinding static. It was not attacking out of malice. It was lashing out in pure, unbearable agony, trying to silence the noise that was tearing its mind apart. Dylan's analog broadcast was the very first moment of silence and soothing harmony the creature had experienced in millennia. The song of the deep sea spoke a universal language of calm. The massive, writhing shadow began to shudder. The violent, angry crimson light pulsing beneath its formless skin flickered and slowly began to soften. The sharp, erratic movements of the tentacles relaxed, drooping gently toward the floor like exhausted vines. The crimson hue shifted, cooling into a gentle, bioluminescent sapphire blue. The creature was listening. It was being held, comforted, and finally understood. Guided by the steady, ancestral rhythm of the human heart and the ancient whale song, the Nullbringer let out a long, resonant vibration that sounded exactly like a deep sigh of relief. The entity slowly, gracefully withdrew its massive tendrils from the assembly hall. The blue light faded as the colossal creature detached its bulk from the station. It turned away from the blinding lights of the galaxy and drifted back toward the endless, quiet sea of stars, slipping into a deep, well-deserved cosmic hibernation. As the creature departed, the crushing electromagnetic interference vanished. The station's emergency power grids automatically rebooted, Golden light flooded back into the hall. The life support fans roared to life, pumping fresh, sweet oxygen back into the desperate lungs of the survivors. No one cheered. The silence that followed was holy. Princess Valia slowly rose to her feet. She looked at the colossal empty space where the god of death had just been. And then she looked at the lone human packing away his copper coils. Without a single word, she stepped forward and dropped to one knee. She did not kneel out of royal protocol. She knelt in absolute, overwhelming awe. Behind her, the surviving vanguard captain fell to his knees. Then the guild masters. Then the delegates. Thousands of the most powerful, arrogant beings in the universe bowed their heads to the cold floor, offering their ultimate reverence to a single individual from a species they had mocked. They bowed to a man who had used empathy, patience, and the primal rhythm of his fragile homeworld to tame the literal death of the universe. Dylan Britton did not acknowledge the sea of kneeling elites. He quietly reached down and picked up his heavy steel tuning fork from the floor. He wiped a smudge of oil from its surface, slipped it into the deep pocket of his faded canvas jacket, and picked up his worn leather suitcase. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing softly in the grand hall. Deep within his analog registry, dozens of new salvage contracts from the most hazardous dead zones in the galaxy were already waiting for him. The arrogant universe still did not understand the dark, and it likely never would. But that was fine. Humanity would always be there, ready to listen to the shadows. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Z Sci-Fi Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.